Welcome, dear listeners. In tonight's tale, a widow appears at 2 funerals, grieving, elegant, and always too close to the mystery. What secret binds the dead and the one left behind? Sharpen your senses before we begin, for every case carries a hidden puzzle meant to test your wits if mysteries cloaked in shadow intrigue you, like this video, and subscribe to join the investigation. Now, light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. It was one of those drab November afternoons when the fog clung low over London like a dirty shroud, seeping through the window panes and turning gas lamps into ghostly halos. I had been rereading a monograph on obscure poisons, which Holmes had authored with such clinical detachment that it felt more akin to a surgeon's notes than a detective's deductions. The fire crackled weakly in the grate. Outside, horse hooves rang against wet cobblestones, and the smell of damp wool and coal smoke crept in with each shift of wind. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, fingers steepled under his chin, unmoving save for the subtle flick of his eyes across the correspondence he'd plucked from that morning's post. His violin lay untouched upon the table, a silent companion to the weighty silence of our shared rooms in Baker Street. "You see, Watson," he murmured suddenly, startling me from my reading. "Here is a letter that purports to describe the impossible." He handed me a cream-colored envelope, already slit open with his penknife. The handwriting inside was meticulous, penned in violet ink upon heavy stationery with the faint scent of bergamot. "Mr. Holmes, I write to you not out of imagination or fancy, but desperation. A woman, clad in mourning, attended the funeral of my late husband last Thursday. She sobbed, she keened, she placed a lily upon the casket. 2 days later, I saw her again, identical in every detail, at the funeral of a man to whom she could have had no earthly connection. She mourned just as publicly, just as theatrically. Her attire, her veil, her very posture. It was as though time had rewound. I made quiet inquiries. Both deceased men died unexpectedly, and both were presumed to have passed peacefully in their sleep. Yet I am not so sure. Please, Mr. Holmes, something is deeply wrong. If I am mad, let me be told so, but if I am not, then we may yet prevent another funeral. Yours sincerely, Mrs. Rosamond Fenchurch." "A widow attending 2 funerals?" I asked, puzzled. "That hardly seems an outrage." "Indeed," Holmes said, rising to pour himself a cup of tea with absent-minded precision. "Except this woman, according to Mrs. Fenchurch's letter, behaved at both events as though personally bereaved, publicly, intimately, yet no one knows who she is." I read the letter again. The repetition was chilling. The same gestures, the same veil, the same delicate placing of a single lily. "She could be an actress," I suggested. "She could be Death's herald," Holmes replied, half in jest, though his eyes gleamed with curiosity. "We mustn't leap to conclusions, Watson. First we observe, then we deduce." He reached for his pocket watch, consulted it, and snapped it shut. "The second funeral was held in St. Dunstan's, a modest chapel in Belgravia. We shall start there. You mean to call upon the priest?" "Indeed. The clergy are often poor liars, which makes them excellent witnesses, and we must discover whether this mystery mourner left any trace beyond bewilderment." 10 minutes later, we were wrapped in our greatcoats, threading our way through the gaslit streets. The fog thickened as we neared Belgravia, swallowing even the sound of our footfalls. St. Dunstan's emerged from the grey like a ship out of mist, its iron gates slick with condensation, its stained glass windows darkened by the clouded light. The priest, a mild man named Father Calhoun, welcomed us with some confusion. "A woman in mourning, you say?" he repeated. "Well, yes." Quite distraught she was. Sat in the front pew before the family arrived. I took her for a sister or a long-lost cousin. She wept as though her heart were breaking. Did anyone speak to her? I cannot say. She left before the interment. Vanished, really. One moment she was there, the next, gone. Holmes scanned the chapel interior. She arrived early, placed herself near the family, and exited without notice. Curious. Did she sign the guest register? Father Calhoun shook his head. No register for that service. It was quite small, and the deceased? A Mr. Jonathan Prowse, a retired surveyor, widowed, lived alone, and the cause of death? Heart failure, I believe. Holmes nodded. We'll need access to the death certificate. And the name of the physician who signed it. Father Calhoun scribbled a name on a scrap of paper, Dr. Elmer Bletchley, Hartnell Street, and handed it over. Back outside, Holmes turned to me with a flicker of excitement in his expression. There is method to her mourning, Watson. But what? Let us see if the good Dr. Bletchley shares my suspicions. And then we shall pay our respects to the first funeral mentioned by Mrs. Fenchurch. As we hailed a cab, Holmes grew uncharacteristically silent, save for a single remark as we passed through the misted avenues. 2 funerals may be a coincidence, Watson. 3 will be murder. The fog had thickened into a cloying soup by the time we arrived at Hartnell Street, and the cabman seemed relieved to be rid of us, tipping his hat and vanishing into the mist before we had even reached the curb. The brass plate beside the door of number 19 read, Dr. Elmer Bletchley, physician and surgeon. It was modest and slightly tarnished, as though the man within had little time or interest for vanity. Holmes rapped sharply, twice, and we were soon admitted by a thin-lipped housekeeper who eyed us with suspicion. Dr. Bletchley himself emerged moments later, a man in his early 60s with watery eyes and a faint tremor in his hand that suggested either advanced age or a long-standing dependence on spirits. I hope this isn't about that coroner's notice, he said with a weary sigh, motioning us toward his study, which reeked faintly of laudanum and pipe smoke. I've already submitted the death certificate to the proper authorities. We come not from the coroner, Holmes said smoothly, but from a higher court, curiosity. That earned a grudging smile from the doctor. Then come in, gentlemen. Let us satisfy your curiosity. Holmes seated himself with the air of one performing a clinical examination of the man across from him. You certified the death of Jonathan Prowse 2 days ago. I did. And the cause? Cardiac arrest. The man was elderly, a touch over 70. Lived alone, according to the housekeeper who found him. He'd suffered mild angina for years. Natural causes, Mr. Holmes. Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. At the mention of my name, Dr. Bletchley stiffened slightly and inclined his head toward me with a physician's reserved camaraderie. A man of our trade, then. You'll know how these things go. Prowse was found slumped beside his reading chair, pipe extinguished, glass of sherry undisturbed. No sign of distress, no evidence of struggle. Heart simply stopped, Holmes interlaced his fingers. And you performed no autopsy? Bletchley frowned. There was no warrant for one. The man had no close kin to insist upon it. His solicitor, a man named Bryce or Price, handled the arrangements. Yet there was a woman at the funeral, Holmes said, watching him closely, dressed in mourning. Weeping, Bletchley blinked. There was. I wasn't present. Of course not. But had you heard any mention of such a person? No, the doctor said slowly. Though now that you mention it, the housekeeper, Mrs. Tilley, did say something odd. Claimed that Mr. Prowse had recently begun receiving letters. Unmarked, no return address. She thought they loved notes at first. He burned each one immediately after reading. Holmes' eyes gleamed. Fascinating. Did she keep any? Unfortunately not. And she took it as none of her business. That's what most housekeepers say, until they find themselves summoned to testify, Holmes murmured. Do you suspect foul play? Bletchley asked. There was no irony in the question, only fatigue. Because I can tell you, Mr. Holmes, the old man looked perfectly at peace. Holmes rose. Dr. Bletchley, if I may request a copy of the certificate? The doctor obliged without protest, opening a desk drawer and producing a duplicate. Holmes accepted it and studied it silently for a moment before folding it into his coat pocket. "We thank you," Holmes said. "You may find in retrospect that your report is not wholly inaccurate, only incomplete." And with that cryptic remark, we returned once more to the heavy fog of the street. As we walked, I attempted to organize my thoughts. Letters without return addresses, a woman in mourning, a man with no close kin. Do you think she was the letter writer? Perhaps, Holmes said, or perhaps she was simply the observer. One does not need to love the deceased to cry their funeral, only to have cause. We made our way back to Baker Street briefly, for Holmes to retrieve a small notebook from his drawer and ring for Mrs. Hudson to bring coffee. No sooner had we sat than the doorbell rang again, and the landlady appeared, her expression wary. "There's a gentleman downstairs, says he must see Mr. Holmes at once." Urgent business. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Send him in." A man in a herringbone coat and dark bowler entered, a solicitor by the look of him, with the anxious manner of one used to bad news. He held his hat in his hands and inclined his head quickly. "Mr. Holmes, I beg your pardon for the intrusion. My name is Clement Bryce. I represent the late Mr. Jonathan Prowse. I've been advised you've been asking questions." Holmes offered a curt nod. "We are interested in the particulars of Mr. Prowse's demise. Your name appeared in connection with the arrangements." Bryce glanced around nervously before continuing. "I may be violating some small confidence, but frankly, sir, I'm disturbed. Mr. Prowse's will was altered last month. Curiously so. The bulk of his estate was reassigned to a new beneficiary. And who might that be?" Bryce hesitated, then handed over a slip of paper from his pocket. Holmes read the name aloud. "Miss Eliza Gray." Neither of us recognized it. "There's more," Bryce continued. "I looked into her. She doesn't exist. Or if she does, there's no trace of her. No birth record, no address. The name is likely fictitious." Holmes leaned back, smiling faintly. "So, our widow weeps not only with grief, but with gain." Bryce blinked. "You think she's a fraud?" "I think she is an orchestrator," Holmes replied. "Perhaps even a collector." The solicitor looked pale. "I hesitate to say it, Mr. Holmes, but might this be a pattern?" Holmes rose, his movements sudden and fluid. "You have arrived at the heart of it, Mr. Bryce. I must ask for copies of the will. The original and the amended version. I'll have them delivered before dusk," Bryce said, already turning toward the door. When he had gone, I turned to Holmes. "You suspect she's done this before?" "I suspect," Holmes said, "that we shall find our mystery mourner has left behind a trail of conveniently dead men, each convinced to alter their last testament. And I suspect that Mrs. Rosamond Fenchurch's letter may have arrived just in time to interrupt the next." He moved to the window, lifting the lace curtain as the fog thinned slightly, revealing the vague outlines of passing cabs and flickering lamps. "We have a name," he said, "a signature on a will, and 2 funerals. The question now is, how many more have there been?" The late afternoon fog had begun to lift as Holmes stood by the window, watching the streets below with a stillness that often preceded his swiftest deductions. Behind him, I paced. I had seen him enter such silences before, coiled, introspective, waiting for the world to send him one more breadcrumb with which to complete the trail. When the documents from Clement Bryce arrived just after 4 o'clock, Holmes received them with a perfunctory nod and retreated to the table, spreading out the 2 versions of Jonathan Prowse's will. I joined him as he examined the legal phrasing with the care of a paleontologist unearthing a fossil. "Note the date of the original," he said, tapping his finger against the older will. 7 years ago, all assets are to be divided among 4 distant cousins and a local charitable trust. No surprises, no drama. He slid the amended version next to it. But here, barely 4 weeks before his death, the entire estate, valued at nearly £6,000, is left to a Miss Eliza Gray, with no stipulations, no witness from the previous version. Just a solicitor and the notary. I frowned. Wouldn't such a change be suspicious on its own? Suspicious, yes. Illegal, no. Especially for a man with no immediate family. And Bryce, it appears, processed the will in good faith. Holmes tapped his forefinger against the signature line. Yet Eliza Gray does not exist. No record of birth, no residence, no bank account, at least under that name, a con woman then. Possibly. But her methods are subtle, elegant. She selects men near the end of their lives, reclusive, perhaps lonely. She ingratiates herself quietly. A letter here, a visit there. She offers the illusion of closeness, of affection, or even redemption. And when the man dies, she appears once at the funeral and vanishes before questions are asked. I stared at the amended document. So you believe Jonathan Prowse was the second? Holmes raised an eyebrow. I believe he is not the first, nor the second. He is simply the latest. He turned from the table abruptly and strode to his desk, retrieving a thin leather-bound index, his personal collection of oddities and unresolved notices from the newspapers and obituaries of the past year. Pages fluttered as he flipped through it, lips moving silently. Then he stopped. Here, he said, tapping the clipping. September last. Walter Rendell, retired civil servant, found dead in his home in Brixton. No sign of violence. The cause of death was cardiac arrest, unmarried, no known heirs. Estate transferred to a Miss Clara Deverell, another. Invented name? I asked. Almost certainly. Clara Deverell does not appear in any registry post-probate. No trace of funds deposited under the name. And most intriguing of all, Rendell's funeral took place at St. Dunstan's. I stared. The same chapel where Prowse was buried. Exactly. Holmes was already reaching for his coat. We're going to pay a call on the rector again. I believe it's time we inquired after the other mourners who've graced St. Dunstan's of late. Father Calhoun seemed startled to see us return so quickly. I must admit, Mr. Holmes, I feared your earlier visit had more weight to it than you let on. Holmes inclined his head. Father, do you recall a funeral service held here in late September? A Mr. Walter Rendell. The clergyman nodded. A quiet affair. No more than 6 in attendance. I remember because the name struck me. Rendell was once in the Ministry of Agriculture, wasn't he? Indeed, Holmes replied. And was there a woman in mourning? Father Calhoun frowned. There was. Sat in the rear this time, though. Not so dramatic as the last. Wore the same kind of veil, black lace, very fine work. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Did she approach the casket? No, she remained seated. But after the service, she did speak briefly to the undertaker. I assumed she was a niece or perhaps an old friend. Did anyone else seem to know her? The priest shook his head. No. And she was gone before the interment. Holmes was silent for a moment, then nodded. Your assistance has been invaluable, Father. One final question. Have there been any other similar funerals in the past year? Elderly gentlemen, few mourners, a solitary woman dressed in mourning. The priest tilted his head. Perhaps, yes. March, I believe. A Mr. Alan Crosley, very old, near 90, died quietly at home. Only 3 mourners, if I recall, one of whom was a woman exactly as you described. She placed a white rose on the casket. That's what stood out. Holmes smiled grimly. Thank you, Father. We stepped out into the encroaching dusk. The street lamps were now flickering to life, casting yellow pools of light into the still lingering fog. 3, Holmes said. That makes 3 men. 3 wills were altered within a month of their deaths. 3 funerals at the same chapel. 3 disappearances of a widow who never leaves a trace. She's using the chapel, I said, as part of the pattern. Precisely. She's consistent but careful. She never attends too large a service. She changes her attire slightly, varies her place in the chapel, but it's the same woman, Watson. I'm certain of it. What do we do next? Holmes hailed a passing cab with a sharp whistle. "To Brixton," he said. "We shall speak with Rendell's former landlady." And then we follow the scent of the rose to its source. As we climbed inside, Holmes leaned forward, his voice low and precise. "This woman, Watson, is not merely a fraud. She's a collector of legacies, a spider spinning silk threads from sentiment, deceit, and lonely men's final wishes." I met his gaze. "Do you believe she's murdering them?" Holmes paused. "Not yet. But whether by poison, suggestion, or simple despair, she may well be the cause." The hansom cab lurched forward as we departed St. Dunstan's, the wheels carving twin paths through the thinning fog. Holmes sat silent beside me, his gaze trained not on the street ahead but somewhere inward where the elements of the puzzle, the names, the funerals, the invented beneficiaries, were arranging themselves into something still invisible to me. By the time we arrived at Brixton, the gloom of early evening had crept over the modest row of terraced houses like a damp woolen blanket. Number 11, Belford Terrace, was a plain but tidy home with lace curtains and a pair of withered geraniums flanking the doorstep. Holmes mounted the steps with his usual quiet urgency and rang the bell. The door was answered by a stout woman in a grey shawl and carpet slippers, her hands dusted with flour. She looked us over with a cautious eye until Holmes offered his card. "We wish only to speak with you about Mr. Walter Rendell," he said gently. "We understand you were his landlady." "I was," she said, relaxing slightly. "Come in then. I've just pulled bread from the oven." The warmth of the parlor was immediate, and the scent of yeast and sage hung in the air. A ticking wall clock, a worn armchair by the fire, a frayed doily atop the tea table, all spoke of quiet domesticity. She introduced herself as Mrs. Hardwick. "You'll have to excuse the mess," she said, gesturing vaguely to nothing in particular. "He's been gone 2 months now, and it's still odd not hearing his cough in the morning." "He was ill?" I asked. "Not that I knew. He had a touch of the shivers now and then, but no worse than most men his age. 82 he was. Kept himself sharp. Chess player he was. Could still win against the board by candlelight." "Was he a solitary man?" Holmes asked. Mrs. Hardwick nodded. "Didn't care much for company, but he had his routines. Papers in the morning, a walk before lunch, a glass of port in the evening. Neat as a pin." "Did he receive visitors?" Holmes asked. "Or correspondence?" She frowned. "Now that you mention it, there was a letter or two near the end. Handwritten, always on pale blue paper. He'd never let me touch them. Said they were private, and one night, 3 weeks before he passed, he came home with a rose." Holmes leaned forward. "A rose?" "A white one, tucked into his coat lapel." I asked him if he'd been to a wedding. He just smiled and said, "No, Mrs. Hardwick. Merely an unexpected kindness." Holmes's expression grew intent. "Did he mention the name Clara Deverell?" She pursed her lips in thought. "Once, after supper when he was rambling, said something like, 'Clara's a romantic, but she won't be disappointed.' I took it for nonsense." "Did he ever describe her? Or did you happen to see her?" Mrs. Hardwick hesitated, then crossed the room to a sideboard drawer. "No description, but I found this the day after he passed." She returned with an envelope. It bore no address, only WR written in looping cursive. Inside was a short note. "Walter, you've brought me such joy with your letters. I'm honored by your trust. What little I have I will cherish. Yours, Clara." No surname, no address, no date. Holmes turned the envelope in his hands as though it might confess its secrets. "May I keep this?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "If it helps you find out who she was." Something always felt odd about how he went. No doctor, no warning. Just gone. We left the house in near darkness, the street lamps casting long golden arms across the wet paving stones. Holmes walked in silence, the letter clutched in his gloved hand. "She seduced him with words," he murmured at last. A soft invasion, Watson. No weapon save the pen and the promise of companionship. And he changed his will for her. Holmes nodded. But each man dies in solitude, and each leaves behind a fabricated heiress. 3 different names, 3 distinct styles. But the pattern is too precise to ignore. We returned to Baker Street to find a telegram waiting for us on the silver tray. Holmes tore it open. Another case. Matching pattern. Client requests. Discretion. Please attend. 18 Marlbank Crescent immediately. Lestrade. Holmes's eyes gleamed. It seems Inspector Lestrade has arrived at the same dance, albeit a step behind. 20 minutes later, we arrived at Marlbank Crescent, a fashionable address tucked just west of Regent's Park. The home was grand, if a little dim, with shuttered windows and ivy curling along the brickwork. Lestrade met us at the door, looking unusually grim. "Gentlemen," he said, ushering us inside, "I don't know what you're already on to, but this case, well, it stinks of something clever." He led us to the drawing room, where a man in his late 60s lay still on a fainting couch, his features composed, his limbs undisturbed. "Name's Howard Withers. Retired magistrate, found this morning by his valet. No sign of struggle. A full bottle of claret on the sideboard. Untouched. The coroner says heart failure." Again Holmes stepped forward, his gaze scanning the room. He bent over the body, examined the fingertips, then the corners of the mouth. "No convulsions," he murmured. "No sign of poison. No spilt drink. Peaceful. Predictable. And entirely too convenient." Watson stepped closer. "Another natural death?" "Perhaps," Holmes said. "But let us see what unnatural signatures may linger." Lestrade gestured to a small writing desk. "Here's what caught my eye." On the desk sat a pale green envelope, different from the others, yet similar in its precise penmanship. Inside, the same message. "Howard, your kindness overwhelms me. I feel as though we've known each other for years. I will honor your wishes with the dignity they deserve. Yours in mourning, Celeste." Holmes looked up sharply. "Celeste," he repeated. "Another name in a string of phantoms." He turned to Lestrade. "Do you know if he recently altered his will?" Lestrade nodded. "Just last week. Solicitor confirmed it. Everything to this Celeste woman. No surname." Holmes straightened. 4 names, 4 deaths, 4 inheritances vanished into air. We are no longer pursuing coincidence, Lestrade. We are hunting a spectre in mourning lace." Lestrade rubbed his temple. "What the devil is she after?" Holmes's reply was a whisper. "Immortality, perhaps." In the margins of other men's legacies, we returned to Baker Street long after dark, the gas lamps flickering behind us as if reluctant to illuminate the trail we now followed. 4 deaths, 4 letters, 4 fictional names, and behind them, one elusive architect of grief, a woman whose mourning garb cloaked motives far colder than sorrow. Holmes wasted no time. He stripped off his coat and gloves, lit a pipe, and began to pace, each measured step a beat in his inner symphony of deduction. "Watson," he said suddenly, "what is the true mark of a predator?" I blinked, startled by the abruptness of the question. "I suppose patience, calculation, a sense for the weak point." "Indeed," he said, tapping ash into the grate, "but also invisibility. Our adversary is no ordinary criminal. She constructs an identity tailored to each man she encounters. She seduces not with appearance, but with empathy. And when the will is signed and the heart succumbs, she disappears, a ghost draped in black. And leaves no footprint behind," I added. Holmes smiled faintly. "Ah, but that is where you are wrong. Even the most delicate of feet leaves impressions, if one knows where to look." He pulled open his desk drawer and extracted a slim folio labeled "Last Wills, Probate Office Records. Unusual Beneficiaries, 1894 to 1895. It was one of his own compilations, compiled through long hours at Somerset House and supplemented by clerks with whom he maintained a discreet relationship. "I began this file last year," he said, flipping to the marked section. "At the time, I believed it a curiosity. Now I see it for what it was, the scaffolding of a larger design." He passed me a page. It listed 6 names, all men over 60, all recently deceased, all with no immediate heirs, and each, in the months before their deaths, had amended their wills to name women with no known pasts. Clara Deverell, Celeste, Miss Grey, Helena, Voss, Beatrice Morn, and A. Lefebvre. I looked up. 6? 6 that we know of, Holmes replied. "I suspect the total is higher. Much higher. What do we do next?" Holmes crossed to the window and pulled back the curtain, staring into the night as though it held the next clue. "The key, Watson, is to anticipate the next death before it occurs. For once, we must not chase the aftermath, but intervene in the pattern itself." He turned to me. "There must be another mark. Another man is presently under her spell. If we can identify him, we can observe her directly. And how do you propose we find such a man?" Holmes reached for his violin and drew the bow gently across the strings. A soft, contemplative note. By examining not only the dead, but the living who orbit them. Solicitors, clerks, and society. Gossip. The kinds of men who hear things whispered in drawing rooms and libraries. He set the violin aside and rang for Mrs. Hudson. "Please send a telegram," he said when she arrived. "To Mycroft Holmes. Mark it urgent. Text to read, request access to recent will alterations for gentlemen over 60 with no next of kin. Confidential, personal interest. Reply soonest." Mrs. Hudson raised her eyebrows but nodded and withdrew. "Mycroft will know where to dig," Holmes said. "He's as much a spider in his own web as our widow is in hers." The reply came by midday. Records enclosed via confidential clerk. You will find 47 recent alterations. 10 match pattern, cross-referenced names attached. Do not ask how. M.H. Holmes opened the folder and scanned the list quickly. He pointed to one. "Here. Ambrose Fenwick, a retired historian, unmarried, no children, lives alone in Mayfair, will recently altered to benefit a Miss Lucinda Rowe. Name unknown to any prior record." I stared at the name. "Lucinda Rowe." Another ghost. Holmes grabbed his coat. "Come, Watson. We must reach Fenwick before his heart gives out or is helped along. Mayfair, for all its refinement, carries its own silence. The silence of money and propriety, of curtains drawn and whispers muffled behind polished wood. Number 23. Blenheim Place was such a house. Stately, precise, yet slightly sunken in its posture, like an old man too proud to use a cane. The butler who answered the bell was grey-haired and formal, clearly trained in discretion. But the name Sherlock Holmes still opened doors, and we were soon seated in a study lined with ancient maps and leather-bound volumes. Ambrose Fenwick, a man of nearly 70, entered moments later, a paisley dressing gown trailing behind him and pince-nez perched delicately on his nose. Holmes greeted him warmly. "Mr. Fenwick, I do beg your pardon for the abrupt call." "We've come on a matter of some delicacy." Fenwick's brow furrowed. "Then let's speak plainly, Mr. Holmes. I'm no longer a man for riddles." Holmes nodded. "You've recently made changes to your will." Fenwick blinked. "Yes. How did you—" "I represent no legal authority," Holmes said quickly. "Only a deep concern for your well-being. Tell me, who is Miss Lucinda Rowe?" The old man's expression shifted. A mix of embarrassment, defensiveness, and, yes, something like longing. "She is a companion." "Of sorts. Has she met you in person?" "No, only letters. But they are—" He hesitated. "They are exquisite. Kind, insightful. She understands things I've never spoken aloud, and you trust her." Fenwick straightened. "I do." Holmes was gentle. "She has asked nothing of you?" "No. Nothing beyond the comfort of our correspondence. Holmes paused, then said, "And yet you've left her your estate?" Fenwick looked away. "She never asked. I volunteered. I've no family, no one to miss me. Why not leave it to someone who values my words?" I saw the faintest crease in Holmes's brow. Sympathy, perhaps, or sorrow. "When was your last letter from her?" Holmes asked. 3 days ago. She wrote that she hoped to visit at last. She said she wished to place a flower on my desk." "A white lily." Holmes turned sharply. "Then she means to come in person." Fenwick nodded slowly. "Tomorrow afternoon. She asked me to prepare tea." Holmes stood. "Mr. Fenwick, I must ask you to delay that invitation, or at the very least allow us to remain present during her visit." Fenwick's lips parted. "Do you believe I'm in danger?" "I believe," Holmes said quietly, "that you are in the middle of something much larger than sentiment." The old man nodded after a pause. "Very well. I don't like deceit, but if it will save trouble, you may remain." As we departed, Holmes was already scribbling a note for Lestrade. "She's coming out of the shadows, Watson. Tomorrow we will see the widow with our own eyes. And if she is who I believe she is, her veil will not be enough to hide her guilt." The following day broke cold and windless, as though London itself held its breath. Holmes had been up since dawn, prowling the flat like a caged panther, checking his watch at 5-minute intervals, polishing and repacking the small pocket revolver he rarely carried, then deciding against it. "You're unusually restless," I remarked, nursing my second cup of tea. He gave a short grunt. "A criminal who kills with opium or a silken word requires a different kind of weapon, Watson. One must be patient, like the fisherman who waits for the ripple on still water. And what bait are we offering today?" "An old man's loneliness," Holmes replied, "and the illusion of a meeting that she believes will be private." At precisely 12:30, we returned to Mayfair and were received once again by Ambrose Fenwick. He had changed into his best waistcoat and trousers, his collar freshly starched, his trembling hands betraying the inward strain of expectation. "She's due at 1, he said, his voice a notch too calm. "I've prepared the tea myself." "You've been most cooperative," Holmes said gently. "Please allow us to observe from the study across the hall. You may speak with her as planned, but do not, under any circumstance, hand over documents, keys, or anything else of value. If she attempts anything untoward, raise your voice with the phrase, 'I must consult my lawyer.' We will come at once." Fenwick nodded solemnly. "I only want the truth, Mr. Holmes. If she's not what she claimed—" "She isn't," Holmes said firmly, then softened. "But let her show you herself." We took up position behind the partially closed study door, with a view of the front hallway through the mirror across from Fenwick's armchair. Time dragged. The ticking of the hall clock felt like a hammer. Holmes did not speak once, nor did he smoke, a sign of immense concentration. Then, precisely at the stroke of 1, the front bell rang. The butler answered. We heard a rustle of skirts and the soft murmur of a woman's voice, cultured, low, with an unmistakable Southern English lilt. She was shown into the drawing room, and the door was closed. Holmes pressed a finger to his lips. We listened. "Mr. Fenwick," came the woman's voice, like velvet brushed across a candle flame. "I hope I'm not too forward in appearing unannounced." "You're exactly on time," Fenwick replied with an audible tremor. "Please sit." "Thank you. It means a great deal to me. To finally meet you." Holmes glanced at me, then toward the hallway. He was listening not just for words, but for tension, modulation, missteps, the tone of a practiced performance. "I trust you received my last letter," she continued. "The one with the poem from Herrick?" "Yes," Fenwick said. "It was beautiful and unexpected." They spoke quietly for several minutes, mostly of books, memories, and the sorts of shared interests that could be easily fabricated by someone with access to old correspondence. Then there was a pause. "You seem anxious," she said. "I am," Fenwick replied. There is something I must ask." Holmes's hand gripped the doorknob. But before Fenwick could utter the prepared phrase, the woman's voice changed, tightened ever so slightly. "I know what you're going to say, Ambrose. About your will," she said it gently, almost lovingly. Fenwick hesitated. "Yes, that's part of it. I never wanted anything from you," she said. "Your gesture was overwhelming. I have nothing. I live in a boarding house in Hammersmith. I've cared for my invalid mother for 10 years. You were the first to speak to me like a human being." Holmes froze. "She's rehearsed this," he whispered. "Every syllable. Listen, she's anticipating doubt. I don't know if any of this is real," Fenwick said, his voice cracking. "Or if I'm just an old fool." "I am real," she said. "Would you like me to leave?" "No," Fenwick said quickly. I must consult my lawyer. Before anything is final, that was the signal." Holmes burst from the study, and I followed on his heels. He flung open the drawing-room door in a single motion. The woman was already rising from her chair. She was perhaps in her early 40s, dressed in elegant but subdued black, a lace veil pushed back from her face. She was not conventionally beautiful, but arresting. High cheekbones, grey-green eyes, and a mouth that seemed permanently poised between a smile and a secret. Her hands, gloved in kid leather, froze at her sides. "Who are you?" Holmes asked. She didn't blink. "I beg your pardon. Who are you?" "I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. Watson. You're addressing Mr. Ambrose Fenwick, whose name appears in 4 recently altered wills involving mysterious women, all aliases, all false, and all pointing to you." Her lips parted slightly. Then, "I think you're mistaken." Holmes stepped forward. "Clara Deverill, Celeste, Lucinda Rowe, Miss Gray, Miss Voss, Beatrice Morn, a Lefebvre. 6 names, 6 men, 6 fortunes. The common factor? A grieving woman, always alone, always gone before questions can be asked. Always the same voice." She said nothing. Holmes lowered his voice. "There's a ledger, isn't there? Somewhere, a record of the names and the dates. You've built this like a spider builds a web, one thread at a time." Her expression was unchanged. "It is not illegal to inherit money, Mr. Holmes," she said, "even from someone who cares for you." "No," Holmes agreed, "but identity theft, fraud, and conspiracy are crimes, and we have letters, signatures, statements from multiple witnesses. You have been observed a flicker there, just behind her eyes." "Your web is collapsing," Holmes said. "Unless you would prefer to explain your side voluntarily?" Still silence. Holmes turned to Fenwick. "I suggest you sit down, sir." He did, shakily. Holmes motioned to me. "Watson," the letter she carried, her bag. I stepped forward. The woman backed away a pace, but said nothing as Holmes retrieved a leather satchel from beneath the side table. Inside was a bundle of documents, tightly bound in twine. Holmes opened it. 6 letters. Each was written in a different hand, all addressed to elderly men, some poetic, some adoring, all sealed with wax. "They're pre-written," Holmes said, showing one to me. "Generic phrases. Just enough warmth to bind trust, but not enough to bind proof. And at the bottom of each letter, the same mark. A tiny pressed emblem like a watermark is nearly invisible." Holmes held it to the light. "An astrolabe symbol. She brands them," he said softly. "Even her lies carry a signature." Finally, the woman spoke. "You can prove nothing." Holmes's smile was faint and sharp. "Perhaps not yet. But Scotland Yard is on the way, and even if you burn every document, you've left behind too many ghosts." As the bell rang below and Lestrade's heavy footsteps ascended the stairs, the woman sat slowly in the chair once occupied by Mr. Fenwick. Her eyes were no longer soft. "Everyone dies alone, Mr. Holmes," she said. "I merely ensured they were remembered." Holmes's expression flickered, something unreadable. And then the moment passed. "Some memories," he replied. are best left unwritten. By the time Lestrade entered the drawing room, accompanied by 2 constables in dark blue tunics, the woman had composed herself with eerie serenity. She rose slowly, without protest, and allowed the officers to take her by the arms. Her gaze never left Holmes. "You may twist this how you like," she said coolly, "but I have broken no laws." "You've woven a fiction so convincing," Holmes replied, "that the law may need time to catch its breath." "But it will catch up," Lestrade gave Holmes a questioning look. "We'll take her to Bow Street. You'll follow for a statement?" "In due time," Holmes said. "She has more to say, but only when she thinks she's safe." As the woman was escorted from the room, Mr. Fenwick remained seated, his fingers trembling against the carved armrest of his chair. He looked far older now than he had even the day before, as though the spectre of betrayal had drained years from his frame. "She was so careful," he murmured. "Not just clever. Kind. It's the kindness that fools you, Dr. Watson." I nodded solemnly. "It's the rarest bait of all." Holmes stepped forward and laid a hand gently on the older man's shoulder. "You're not the fool here, Mr. Fenwick." She calculated everything. The isolation, the longing, the vulnerability. "You were not chosen because of weakness. You were chosen because of trust." Fenwick exhaled shakily. "Do you believe she's done this many times before?" Holmes glanced at the satchel of letters now secured in his coat pocket. "I believe her record begins years ago, perhaps even before the earliest will we've found. The names may vary, but the method never does. Back at Baker Street, Holmes placed the bundle of forged letters on the table with the care of an archivist handling cursed scripture. He lit a lamp, adjusted the shade to better illuminate the documents, and began to sort them. "Note the spacing," he murmured. "The margins are exact." Each letter is structured with calculated escalation. First, gentle curiosity, then gratitude. Finally, devotion. No sudden leaps, no excess. The handwriting shifts slightly with each persona, yet retains the same leftward lean. It's the work of a trained forger, or someone who's practiced until even her lies flow. Naturally, he handed one to me. I examined it closely. There's a pattern in the phrasing. She uses the word solace in 3 separate letters, and grace in 2 more than that, Holmes said. She constructs a character in each letter. Sometimes an orphaned schoolteacher. Sometimes a nurse is caring for an ailing parent. Once, even an expatriate widow returned from Rhodesia. She chooses what the man wants most to believe. "Loneliness answers loneliness," I said quietly. Holmes tapped a sheet with the astrolabe symbol at the bottom. "This insignia, this is her only constant. A personal brand, hidden in the paper, pressed so faintly you'd miss it unless you held it to the light. A signature without a name." "Exactly," Holmes said. "Her real name may remain unknown for some time, but this mark binds her to each inheritance. And that, Watson, is where she has made her mistake." He leaned back, steepling his fingers. "Now we must go backwards, not forwards. We have her captured in the present, but to bring justice, we must uncover the past. To secure conviction, we need not only suspicion, we need evidence tied to more than Mr. Fenwick's near victimhood." "You mean to identify the other deceased men," I said, "and prove she orchestrated their altered wills?" "Precisely." He pulled a sheet of notepaper from his drawer and began to write. "We already have 6 names, but now we must go beyond the patterns, beyond the dates. We must search the archives, not only probate, but newspapers, obituary columns, funeral notices, parish records." "Obituaries?" I asked. "She has a preference for modest funerals," Holmes replied. "Services that pass unnoticed. But someone always remembers, a housekeeper, a solicitor, a distant cousin who wrote too late. We trace those threads, and we will find the cocoon of each identity she's woven." At that moment, a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a folded telegram on a silver tray. Holmes opened it, his eyes narrowed as he read. From Inspector Lestrade. Woman refuses name, no match in police registers, fingerprints taken, awaiting confirmation from French authorities. Holmes nodded. Ah, I suspected she might have operated abroad. You believe she's French? Perhaps. Or perhaps she began her career there. The name Lefebvre, used in one of the forged wills, is of French origin, and the astrolabe, historically tied to both navigation and alchemy, suggests a symbolic affinity with manipulation and disguise. He turned back to his files. We must examine cases from the continent, lonely men of wealth, quiet deaths, sudden changes in legal inheritance. If she has truly eluded identification, then she may have traversed borders under countless masks. He stood suddenly, animated by a new line of reasoning. Watson, I must send word to my contact at Le Figaro in Paris. The French archives may hold earlier victims. I rose to fetch my coat. And what shall I do? You, my dear fellow, Holmes said, will return to Somerset House. Request the full probate list from the past 4 years. Search for any names lacking known heirs, particularly those with late alterations involving solitary women. He reached for his inkpot. And ask about Charles Véron. I paused. Véron. He was a minor diplomat who died in London 5 years ago. No family. Left a considerable fortune to a woman named Amélie Duret. No trace of her has ever been found. I dismissed it at the time. But now, I believe she was her first London victim. I nodded, understanding the scope. So it may not be 6 names, or even 10, Holmes smiled darkly. It may be dozens, or more. As I stepped out into the misty afternoon, I glanced back at him, already hunched over his desk, consumed by the hunt not just for a criminal, but for the legacy she had sculpted out of illusion. She had counted on grief. She had banked on loneliness. She had trusted that a woman in mourning could never be questioned too harshly. But she had never met Sherlock Holmes. It was nearly dusk when I returned to Baker Street, chilled to the bone from a day spent trawling the cold, impersonal ledgers of Somerset House. The probate records were orderly to a fault. Rows of names, dates, monetary sums, executors. But what struck me was not what was written. It was what wasn't. There were too many patterns that echoed Holmes's suspicions. Elderly men, modest estates, and in nearly a dozen cases, vague or invented beneficiaries, often women with names that appeared nowhere else in official records. I stepped into our sitting room to find Holmes seated cross-legged in his chair, pipe in hand, a French newspaper spread across his knees, and the lamplight turning his silhouette into something nearly mythic. He did not look up. You found them, then? I removed my gloves and laid a folder on the table. 9 more cases. At least that many that fit the pattern. I cross-referenced the alterations. 7 wills changed within 6 months of death. 2 changed mere weeks before. All to women with no traceable history. Holmes tapped the pipe against the ashtray. She's been very busy indeed. And you? I asked, settling opposite him. He finally looked up, eyes gleaming. France, Watson. And not just France. Belgium, Austria, even 1 case in Canada. Her reach spans further than I dared estimate. My contact at Le Figaro confirmed 4 similar cases from Paris, all between 1887 and 1890. The names differ, but the method is unmistakable. Letters? Yes, always letters. Always widows, nurses, or forgotten daughters. Always grief repackaged into opportunity? She's been perfecting it, I said grimly, refining the pattern. Holmes handed me a clipping from a French-language obituary. I scanned it slowly. Pierre Lagarde, I read. Retired merchant, found dead in his Montmartre flat. No known relatives. Estate left to one Mademoiselle Renée Larue. No such person ever located. Sound familiar? Holmes asked. I nodded. Too familiar. He rose suddenly and crossed to his desk, withdrawing the folio of letters she had left behind. One by one, he laid them across the table, each bearing a different name. a different persona. Yet when placed side by side, the deceit was obvious. The syntax, the rhythm, the sentiment. All different faces, he murmured, but the same puppeteer. I leaned over the desk. What's the next step? She's in custody. We can begin prosecuting her under any number of aliases. Holmes shook his head. It won't be enough. Not enough? She hasn't broken. She believes she's done no wrong, or at least that no one can prove otherwise, unless we uncover the foundational fraud, the first lie, the true identity. She will deny until the day she dies, and clever solicitors will argue ambiguity until the courts are exhausted. And the victims? Holmes looked up sharply. Will remain only half avenged. If the law sees her merely as a swindler, then she has won. But if we can trace her all the way back to the first man, perhaps the first death she influenced rather than inherited, then we tip the scales. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, balancing a small bundle. A letter came for you, Mr. Holmes. No return address. Hand-delivered by a boy in a dark coat. Said it was urgent and private. Holmes accepted the envelope, brow furrowing. He studied the seal, unmarked red wax, and sliced it open. He read it once, then again. What is it? I asked. He handed it to me without a word. Mr. Holmes, she was not always alone in her work. There was a man. Once. He helped forge the documents, created identities. He knew how to vanish. She called him Aram. He disappeared years ago. I believe she fears his return more than your investigations. If you wish to know more, ask her what became of the man who died in the winter of '88. The one with the ring she never returned. A friend, I looked up. Aram. Holmes was already moving toward his bookshelf. The winter of 1888, that would place us before her arrival in England. She was working elsewhere, perhaps Paris or Brussels. Find me obituaries or probate notices from that winter with any reference to a man whose ring, be it a wedding band or a signet, was listed as missing or unclaimed. You believe this Aram existed? Not only that, Holmes said. I believe he may have been her partner, possibly even her lover. And if she betrayed him or disposed of him, then there may be more to her crimes than inheritance fraud. A darker implication hung unspoken. Do you think she's killed? I think, Holmes said grimly, that she's walked up to the edge of murder many times. Whether she stepped over that line depends on Aram. If we find him or his body, we change the shape of the entire case. I looked down at the letter again. But who sent this? Holmes stared into the fire, eyes narrowed. Someone who knows her intimately. Someone who's watched from the sidelines. Or perhaps once played a part. He returned to his desk and began scribbling another letter. I must send to Brussels. There was a forger named Aram Lestrieux who vanished in early '89. Operated under half a dozen names. Rumors said he was last seen with a woman answering her description, and if it's him, then we must find what she did with him, and what he left behind. We sat in silence as the fire crackled, each of us turning the puzzle in our minds. The case had begun with a woman weeping at funerals, but now it stretched across borders, years, and the faint outline of something far colder than grief. She's not just a fraud, I said finally. She's a ghost who buries her past in the coffins of others. Holmes did not answer immediately. Then he said, very softly, No, Watson. She's something worse. She's the author of Absence. The Morning Post arrived with an unusual haste that could only mean Holmes had summoned more than one errand boy. Our breakfast tray remained untouched as he spread telegrams and newspaper clippings across the sitting room floor like a cartographer plotting hidden territories. 3 men in Brussels, he said, pointing to one notice with his pipe. All died within the same 12-month span, early 1888 through mid-1889. Elderly, unmarried, and each left their fortunes to a woman named Marie Devienne. She does not exist in any census or parish record. The pattern is identical. And the ring? I asked. Holmes handed me a clipping from La Gazette de Bruxelles, dated February 1888. It described the death of one Victor Host, a retired colonial official. The obituary was sparse, but a short note appended at the end caught my attention. A distinctive gold ring with a red enamel seal, worn by the deceased daily, was not found among his effects. Anyone with knowledge is asked to contact the executor. A wedding band? I asked. Possibly, Holmes said, but more likely a signet. Something personal, likely engraved, something a woman like her might have kept. A trophy. He stood abruptly. And if we can prove she took it, Watson, then we place her not only in the room with the dead, but in possession of their secrets. There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a familiar expression that said another visitor had arrived unannounced. "She's back, Mr. Holmes," she said with tight lips. "The one from Bow Street. Says she'll speak only with you." Holmes's eyebrows lifted. Already? That is, sooner than expected. Within moments, she was seated once more in our sitting room, though now stripped of her veil and pretense. Her name, according to Lestrade's temporary report, was being entered as Jane Doe. No definitive identification yet confirmed, but she looked no less composed for the lack of titles. If anything, the absence of disguise made her presence more unsettling. "I have nothing to gain from silence," she said, glancing at the cluttered table. "But I'll only speak on my terms." Holmes tilted his head. "Then let us at least begin with mutual understanding. Tell me about Aram." A flicker of something passed over her expression, pain, perhaps, or the calculated mimicry of it. "You know that name," she said softly. "Of course you do." He was too reckless to stay hidden. "Is he dead?" Holmes asked. She looked away. "He betrayed me." "That is not an answer." She turned back, eyes suddenly hard. "He was greedy. He wanted more than we agreed. He began forging documents in his own name. He made mistakes, and you corrected them," Holmes said. "Permanently?" She did not answer at once. When she spoke, it was not with pride nor remorse, but something more elusive. "He went to Vienna. He thought he could start his own legacy network. I followed him as far as Strasbourg. After that, I stopped caring." Holmes studied her in silence. Then he said, "One of your victims, Victor Host, was known to wear a ring, a red enamel seal. It vanished after his death." Her eyes didn't flicker. "I wouldn't know," she said. "I never met him." "But you wrote to him." She gave a faint smile. "I wrote to many." "You're not foolish," Holmes said. "You're meticulous. You kept something, a token, perhaps from each man. You told Mr. Fenwick you would bring him a flower, but I suspect the true mementos are far more personal." "I've already been searched," she said. "There's nothing to find." Holmes gestured to the table of letters. "Not on you, perhaps. But somewhere, in a box, a drawer, a satchel hidden in a station locker. They're more than trophies, aren't they? They're a way of holding on, of proving to yourself that you mattered more than they suspected." For the first time, her expression cracked, not with confession, but with something deeper, the raw wound of being understood. "Why the ring?" Holmes asked. She didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "Because it was his. Aram's. Yes. He gave it to me when we first began, when we thought it was all just letters and favors. Before he wanted more, before he began taking care of himself." "You gave it to Host?" "No," she said. "I kept it. But Host had a ring that looked like it, uncannily. When he died, I took his too. I don't know why. Maybe to erase the memory, so you do keep tokens." She didn't deny it. Holmes turned away and addressed me. "Watson, have the constable at Bow Street search her belongings again. Every suitcase, every seam, every button lining. The ring is real." She rose suddenly. voice low. "You want to know who I am, Mr. Holmes?" "We already do." "No, you know the actress, the letter writer, the widow in lace. But before Aram, I was nothing. He found me selling violets in the rain. I didn't even have a surname. He taught me how to disappear." Holmes's voice was calm. "And you taught yourself how to be seen. To matter, to weep at a funeral and have strangers comfort you." She moved toward the door. "You've won, Mr. Holmes. You'll get your court case. The newspapers will name me the widow of Inheritance Row. But none of you will understand what I took. What I really took." "And what was that?" I asked. Her eyes met mine. "The only thing the world never gave them, someone who listened." She left without another word. Holmes stood for a long while in the quiet that followed, his face unreadable. "She believes that?" I said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "And that is the most dangerous kind of criminal, the one who believes her own kindness excuses the wreckage she leaves behind." He walked to the fire and stirred the embers. "If she kept the ring, we'll find it. And when we do, we'll know exactly which man was the first to pay the price for believing in her." I asked, "And if we don't?" Holmes's voice was almost a whisper. "Then all we'll have is silence and a list of names carved into stone." The following morning brought not the ring, but a revelation. Lestrade had personally overseen a second search of the woman's belongings, this time with Holmes's cryptic instructions in hand, to examine not only her trunk, but every lining, every stitch, every false panel. The report, which arrived by hand at 10:15, was terse but potent. Item recovered: velvet-lined sachet, hand-stitched. Contents: 6 dried flower petals, each tagged with a slip of paper bearing a man's initials and date. 1 gold signet ring engraved with a stylized H ring matches description from Brussels newspaper archives. Victor Hoste. Holmes read the note aloud, then leaned back in his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had finally plucked the final thread from a tangled knot. "Each petal, a memory," he murmured. "Each name, a thread in her veil." "She kept them like relics," I said, deeply unsettled, "as if they were sacraments." Holmes nodded. "Indeed. She did not only take wealth, she curated the remnants of grief. She preserved herself in the memory of men who no longer existed to speak the truth." I studied the report again. "And now we have the ring." "The seal on her past," Holmes replied. "Victor Host's signet, long presumed lost, is now tied directly to her. A keepsake from the one man who may have marked the beginning." I folded the report. "It will hold in court. Combined with the false identities, the altered wills, and the surviving letters? Yes, she will be convicted. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, perhaps even manslaughter, depending on the court's sentiment and our ability to prove that some of her victims might have lived longer if not for her influence." Holmes stood and began to pace, though his energy was no longer driven by agitation. It was reflection now, the kind that came only when the shape of the puzzle had been revealed. "She told us she started as nothing," he said. "And in a sense, she wasn't lying. She made herself someone by weaving herself into other people's endings, but that need, the need to be remembered, was the one thing she could never fake. And it is the very thing that will undo her." I sat in silence as he moved to the window, gazing out into the fog-thinned morning. London was stirring below. A milkman passed, followed by a brougham carriage. The city was unaware that one of its most beguiling predators had finally been caged. Moments later, Lestrade arrived in person, looking both triumphant and vaguely disturbed. "We found the box exactly where you said it might be," he said to Holmes, "sewn into the base lining of her trunk, like a magician's false drawer. Took nearly half an hour just to get to it without damaging the contents." "You catalogued the petals?" Holmes asked. Lestrade nodded and opened his own notebook. "Each one dried and labeled. Initials, place, and, get this, an endearment. W.R. Brixton, my dearest recluse. Or J.P. Belgravia. the gentleman with the trembling hands. Even the aliases meant something to her. They weren't just constructs. She lived them, Holmes rubbed his chin. She constructed entire worlds in her mind. Correspondence gave her access to identity, the one thing she believed she could never build on her own. "Well," Lestrade said, snapping the notebook shut, "she'll have plenty of time to write letters where she's going." "Perhaps," Holmes murmured, "but I wonder if her next reader will be as forgiving." Later that afternoon, we attended a closed-door session with the Crown's prosecutor and several Scotland Yard officials to determine the next steps. With Holmes's presentation of evidence, carefully ordered, impeccably sourced, and delivered with surgical clarity, the decision to proceed with formal charges was unanimous. Outside, the fog had lifted, and the gaslight no longer flickered with its usual melancholy. Holmes and I walked through Bloomsbury in silence until he spoke again. "Watson, tell me, do you believe a crime can be beautiful?" I frowned. "Beautiful. Number, intricate perhaps, even tragic. But beauty implies some purity, and this was wrought beneath embroidery." Holmes nodded as if he'd expected the answer. Yet she believed it was beautiful, that she offered something more than theft, that her presence at those funerals lent grace to otherwise unlamented men, sighed. "It's the oldest lie in the book, Holmes. That intention can erase consequence." Holmes's face hardened slightly. "And yet it is the lie we most often use to justify ourselves." We returned to Baker Street to find a final note waiting for Holmes. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably hers, looped, slanted, emotionally modulated like a private aria. "You were right. I did keep them. Not because I wanted to hurt anyone, but because I was afraid of disappearing again. You think you've ended something, but I was never the only one. Aram was not the beginning. He was the only one who taught me to look. And when I'm gone, someone else will do the same, because there are always men who leave nothing behind but their names, and women who know how to wear them like gloves. I don't expect your pity, only your understanding. You, of all people, know the thrill of being the only one who sees the whole design. I was the story they needed, and I made sure they remembered me." Holmes read it twice before folding it neatly and placing it in the flame of the hearth. The paper curled quickly, blackened, and crumbled to ash. "Understanding," Holmes said. "She asks it as if it were forgiveness." "And you won't give it?" I asked. Holmes stared into the fire, then whispered, "No, Watson. Because I do understand her. That is what makes it unforgivable." Outside, a wind had risen, stirring the leaves in Baker Street. The city carried on. The dead rested, their names reclaimed from the embroidered fantasies of the widow in black. And Holmes, though silent, seemed at last to have made peace. Not with her, but with the shape of the shadow she cast. The trial was to begin in 3 weeks. In the intervening days, Holmes busied himself not with the court proceedings, which he left to the Crown's barristers, but with something far more personal. He continued to compile a dossier, not for the judge or jury, but for himself. He called it the Ledger of Unremembered Men. Each name must be reclaimed, he told me as we sat one evening with lamplight casting long shadows across his writing desk. Not just listed, but understood. Their habits, their regrets, their letters. The widow recorded only what suited her illusion. I intend to write down what was real. I was silent for a moment. Is that justice? He looked up at me. Justice belongs to the courts. This is something older, something quieter, the restoration of dignity. The following morning brought an unexpected development. Lestrade arrived, coat damp from rain, with a dispatch from the Bow Street jail. He had not slept, that much was clear, and his face bore the sour expression of a man who'd seen the wheels of bureaucracy grind in all the wrong directions. "She's refused counsel," he said, dropping heavily into the armchair. "Won't allow a defense. Won't name a solicitor. Won't respond to the charges." Holmes raised an eyebrow. A silence born of strategy or surrender? Neither, Lestrade said grimly. She calls it mourning. Says she's grieving for the world that never made space for her. I exhaled slowly. She means to play martyr. Lestrade nodded. And it's working. There's already talk among certain circles. Writers, the press, even a few women's societies about her so-called cause. That she was reclaiming forgotten lives. That she gave something beautiful to men on the brink of death. Holmes leaned forward. A woman who manipulates grief for gain and rewrites her crimes as compassion is more dangerous than 1,000 common swindlers. Lestrade handed over a folded clipping. Too late for that. The Illustrated London News just printed a full-page profile, called her the Mourning Angel. Holmes's fingers clenched ever so slightly. Then, with forced calm, he laid the clipping aside. Public sentiment is no stranger to confusion, he said, but facts remain. We have the ring, we have the letters, we have the false identities and the fraudulent wills. The court cannot ignore evidence, no matter how prettily grief is adorned, but I saw something shift in him then. Not doubt, precisely, but unease. Holmes did not fear the law's failure. He feared the world's tendency to forgive charm, particularly when veiled in tragedy. Later that day, we received word that a man had come forward, a Frenchman who identified himself as Etienne Rousseau, claiming to have once worked with Aram Lestrieux. He was gaunt, with a permanent stoop and fingers stained with ink. We met him in a discreet office near the French consulate. Rousseau was soft-spoken and reluctant, but Holmes's name and the mention of La Veuve Noire, the Black Widow, seemed to unlock something. I remember them, Rousseau said, eyes far away. She called herself Celeste then. Aram trusted her. Too much, I think. She never shouted. She never demanded. But when she looked at you, it was as though she saw the future. And you didn't. Why did Aram vanish? Holmes asked. He was afraid, Rousseau said. Not of prison, of her. He said she was beginning to believe the lies. That the letters she wrote were no longer just tricks. They were her truth. He told me, if I vanish, she will carry on, and she will be better at it than I ever was. Holmes nodded. Do you believe she killed him? Rousseau hesitated. I believe he went to Vienna. I believe she followed him, and I believe no one has seen him since. And the ring, I asked. He never took it off. He called it his oath. Holmes leaned back. Then it is more than a trinket. It is her signature act. Rousseau offered us one final detail before leaving: a name. A burial registry entry from Vienna under the name Jacques Durand, unclaimed and without documents. No cause of death listed, just a burial in a pauper's plot. Holmes sent for the record immediately. 2 days later, the reply confirmed it. Jacques Durand matched Aram's physical description precisely. Found in a boarding house, death was ruled as natural. No inquiry was made. The body was interred within 48 hours. But among his effects, a letter, unsigned, written in French, beginning with the words, "You broke the story we were writing together." It was her handwriting. Holmes stared at it a long time. Premeditation, I said softly. Yes, he replied. And closure. We delivered the evidence to Lestrade, who promised it would be introduced as part of the prosecution's final submission. The ring, the flower petals, the list of names, and now the death of Aram Lestrieux. Murder by manipulation, if not by hand. The trial, when it began, was unlike any other in recent memory. The courtroom was filled with a peculiar blend of hushed gossip and sharpened silence. Journalists perched like crows in the gallery. The accused sat alone, dressed not in mourning black but in a pale gray gown that made her seem more spectre than woman. She did not speak, not even when the ring was held up, not when the ledger of letters was opened, not when the executor from Brussels recounted how Victor Hoste's will had been altered without signature verification. But when Holmes was called to testify, she looked up. He stood calmly, clearly, and without embellishment laid out the sequence of her crimes. He did not gloat. He did not moralize. He let the facts speak. The false names, the altered wills, the letters with calculated phrasing, the emotional manipulation, the victims who had no one to speak for them. Until now. Only when he finished did she speak, and it was only one sentence. "You forget, Mr. Holmes," she said, voice low, "that they wanted me to be real." Holmes replied without pause, "That does not make you true." The courtroom held its breath, and then the judge nodded. The trial would continue. But the myth had begun to unravel. The verdict came quietly on the afternoon of the fourth day. No public gasp followed the reading, no cries, no collapsing of spectators or last-minute confessions. Only the rustle of paper, the clink of the judge's gavel, and the whisper of pens scratching in the hand of journalists. It was a rare kind of silence, neither shocked nor solemn, but one that suggested the city had simply absorbed another oddity into its long memory. The woman known to a dozen dead men by a dozen different names was found guilty on all counts: fraud, criminal impersonation, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. The ring, the false identities, the forged wills, each thread of her tapestry had been presented, measured, and cut down. Holmes and I remained seated until the court began to empty. She had not looked at the jury. She had not wept. Only once, just before being led away, did she glance across the courtroom to Holmes. Not a look of hatred, nor even regret. It was something else. Perhaps recognition, or perhaps the quiet acknowledgement of being seen not as a fiction, but as a fact, finally. Lestrade leaned over as the guards escorted her from the dock. "Well, that's that," he said. "I dare say she'll have a quieter audience now." Holmes did not answer. Outside, a grey drizzle dusted the paving stones of Old Bailey. A few onlookers lingered, hoping to catch a final glimpse of the woman the newspapers had dubbed the widow who collected names. But she was taken through the side exit into a waiting carriage and vanished into the folds of London's institutional machinery. We walked in silence for some time, the rain tapping lightly on Holmes's hat and my coat. It was only as we reached the junction of Fleet Street that he spoke. "She never gave her real name, Watson." "No," I replied, "only the name she borrowed." Holmes stopped and looked up at the grey sky. "And still the world will remember her." "More than it remembers the men she built her lies upon. That bothers you?" "Of course it does," he said, "because in a century she will be remembered in fiction, in lectures, in curiosity cabinets. But Rendell, Host, Prowse, men who once lived and breathed, will remain only as footnotes." "Then perhaps," I said, "it is our duty to ensure that doesn't happen." He looked at me for a long moment and then, quietly, nodded. Back at Baker Street, Holmes returned to the ledger of unremembered men, a leather-bound journal whose pages were now half filled with names, dates, memories, fragments of letters, and brief vignettes of each man who had been caught in her web. It was not part of any legal proceeding. It would not be published. Holmes had no intention of capitalizing on it, nor submitting it to the Crown. It was, in a sense, a form of atonement, not for any crime he had committed, but for the world's indifference. One evening, as he wrote, he read aloud to me, "Walter Rendell of Brixton, a chess player, meticulous in dress, fond of almond cakes and stories about the Crimean War. Wrote long letters to a woman he never met, believing she was a music teacher who had once lost her voice in a carriage accident. He signed each letter, 'Yours in thought, W.R.' Holmes paused. He deserved more than a signature." "They all did. They have you now," I said. "No," he replied. "They have the truth." "That is better." In the weeks that followed, Holmes received 2 unexpected letters. The first was from the brother of Ambrose Fenwick, recently arrived from India. He had heard of the trial and wrote to thank Holmes for preserving Ambrose's reputation and, in a sense, his life. The letter was brief, but heartfelt, and enclosed with it was a photograph of Ambrose in his youth, standing at a telescope, smiling faintly, surrounded by books. Holmes placed it inside the ledger. The second letter was unsigned, a single line on crisp cream paper. She was not the only one who knew how to vanish. Holmes stared at it a long while. "A copycat?" I asked. "Or someone who knew her methods? Or admired them? Do you believe more exist?" He gave a weary sigh. "There are always more. But none like her." He considered that. Perhaps not in method. But in motive, certainly. The need to matter, the desire to be remembered. It is as human as breath. I poured 2 cups of tea and sat opposite him as the fire flickered low in the grate. "She did believe she gave something to those men," I said. "Do you think, even in her manipulation, she comforted them?" Holmes tapped ash from his pipe, eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Perhaps," he said at last. "But then again, arsenic in tea can be sweetened with honey. That does not absolve the poisoner." He rose and crossed to the window, looking down at Baker Street as the rain thickened into a light storm. Below, a child ran laughing through puddles while a weary man lit a street lamp. The world, as always, went on. "You see, Watson," Holmes said softly, "she built a house from borrowed names. But it was built on the graves of those who thought they'd found someone who would remember them. And now," Holmes said, "they are remembered." He tapped the ledger gently once, and for Holmes, for the widow, for the names she wore and the ones she buried, the case was, at last, closed.